I thank my colleague, Senator McCaskill, and she's absolutely right. We are grateful to the entire Senate for jumping in on this, because we would not have gotten to the bottom of this without getting the Senate to decide for the first time in 21 years this question, are we going to enforce a subpoena or not? And people stepped up, and as a result, we were able to, through the court system, with the sanction of criminal liability as a possibility, to get these folks to come forward and to provide this information. They never really testified. They came forward and they claimed their Fifth Amendment rights, but at least we were able to get 1 million pages of documents, 1 million pages. And then we sifted through 1 million pages of documents to discover, lo and behold, these people actually knew what they were doing. In fact, they were altering ads. They'd get an ad from somebody selling an underage girl. The ad would say something like schoolgirl or cheerleader or young girl. They would then edit that ad to take out those words that would indicate what was going on, and they knew what was going on, and then they would place the ad anyway. In other words, they would make the money, make the profit, knowing that they were selling an underage girl online. They also then were destroying the evidence that later law enforcement could use to go after these people. So this is evil, and this has been happening. And we've heard the stories. I talked about Yvonne Ambrose. We talked about Kabiki Pride. We talked about Nicole J. We talked about some of these mothers and their daughters who have gone through this horrific situation. And you heard earlier about Desiree. This was the 16-year-old who was being sold on Backpage, and on Christmas Eve, she was murdered. Imagine getting that call as a parent. We've talked before about the testimony we received in the committee with regard to the 14-year-old girl who had gone missing. And Kabiki Pride is her mom. Kabiki Pride said she was missing for several weeks, and someone finally told her, why don't you check on Backpage.com? So she did. She went on Backpage.com and found her daughter, who'd been missing for weeks. And imagine the mixed emotions there, the relief of finding her daughter, but her horror to see that these were explicit sexual photographs of a 14-year-old being sold for sex. So she did what you would do as a mom. She called Backpage immediately and said, I found my daughter on your website. She's 14 years old. Thank you for taking down that ad and helping me connect with my daughter. The answer from Backpage.com? You didn't pay for the ad. We won't take it down. Again, talk about evil. And think of the heartbreak. And later, when she was reunited with her daughter, she was one of those brave moms, and her daughter was one of those brave victims who said, you know what, we're going to file a lawsuit and go public with this and talk about our experience and the trauma that this young 14-year-old girl had gone through, repeatedly raped by older men, and we're going to hold these websites accountable. But you know what happened? The court system said, I'm sorry, under a federal law passed by this body, 21-year-old law, this website is not culpable. They have a shield, they have an immunity. And that's why we're here today. That's why we're here today. Justice cannot always be seen, but its absence is felt. And the absence of justice is exactly what we're trying to address here today. So you've heard from my colleagues, and I appreciated all four of them speaking up and talking about their experiences and how we got to this point. We may hear from a couple other colleagues later today who were part of helping us to put together a sensible approach that targeted this activity and ensured we had freedom of the internet on the one hand, but on the other hand, that this criminal activity wouldn't continue to go on here in America in this century at this time. Again, as we've learned, this is where you see the increase in trafficking. You not only hear this from the experts who give us their data showing huge increases in trafficking reports, but you also hear it and feel it from the victims and the survivors who I've met with in Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus and Dayton and Akron, and they tell me the same story, which is, you know, yeah, I was sold online. It's very efficient. One 9-year-old girl was sold online by her father. I first met her when she was almost 20 years old, and she'd finally escaped from the clutches of her own father. But think about that, Backpage, going from sporting event to sporting event around the country, Backpage, online, being sold many times on a single night with the efficiency of the internet. So this is legislation that is overdue, in my view, and it's required. The courts have told us that. The district attorneys have told us that. The attorneys general have told us that. 50 of them wrote us a letter saying, make this change. They've all said, Congress, step forward. They've not just invited us to do it, they've welcomed us to pass this legislation to give these families the justice they deserve and to give our prosecutors the ability to go after them. And one thing that I hope has been clear from the other comments we've heard today is that one of the important parts of this legislation is simply allowing these local prosecutors we talked about earlier to be able to take these cases using the federal standard, but take these cases rather than just relying on the Department of Justice. Having said that, those million pages and sifting through it and our report and all the documents we received, and you can go online to see this at the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, PSI. We did provide this to the Justice Department. We did provide this to any of the prosecutors around the country who were interested. We did provide it to others who are pursuing lawsuits. So they have information now that they never had before, but we also need to change this law. And that's what we're about today. You heard from my colleagues about the amendments that are likely to be offered. We're told there'll be 2 amendments. The first amendment is one that is going to be called a moderating amendment, meaning that if somebody is on their website moderating the website, cleaning up the website, they should be given a good faith exception. Let me just be clear on this amendment. It is a poison pill, and it will make it easier for those sites that are involved in sex trafficking to continue to do so. Right now, under current law, there is a good faith exception. It's a Good Samaritan exception under current law. We actually restate that in our legislation to be absolutely clear that if you're one of the good guys, a website online, it wants to be sure that your site is not going to have these girls being sold, we talked about earlier, that you should be protected. However, this legislation, having restated the Good Samaritan provision, also says that if you're one of the bad actors, you don't have that protection. This First Amendment that is going to be offered is including those protections for some of the bad actors. It purposely strips the good faith element, and I believe, again, it would assist online sex traffickers rather than hold them to account. For instance, if a Backpage or other website filters for illegal content and as a result learns that its platform is being used for human trafficking but ignores that activity, I think this amendment would say that evidence cannot be considered in a case against Backpage. To me, that's wrong. So I hope that First Amendment will be handled appropriately, which is to say we don't want to weaken this bill or have a poison pill here. By the way, all of the law enforcement community nationally represented by their associations agrees with us, as do the victims groups, as do the groups who are concerned about the effect of trafficking girls and women and boys online, and so we're together on this with all the outside groups. The Second Amendment is going to be asking for additional Department of Justice resources specifically to combat online trafficking. Now look, I support funding to investigate and prosecute traffickers, of course, but we have to appropriate that funding in the proper manner. This amendment will be subject to a budget point of order because it's not going through the right process. The right process is the bill we'll be taking up, I hope, day after tomorrow, which should be the spending bill. In fact, there are 3 budget points of order that the Committee on Budget here in the United States Senate has found against this amendment. So again, this is an amendment that is subject to points of order. Every law enforcement group in the country opposes the amendment because, as one law enforcement said, it is, quote, a poison pill that is dead on arrival if sent back to the House. So we've got to be sure and defeat these amendments in order to have this legislation move forward. And I hope that my colleagues will all stick with us on that, as they have stuck with us through this process of getting the information of coming up with the right legislation, of being sure that we have the opportunity to take it to the floor and to get a clean vote, to get it to the President's desk, get it signed, and starting now, in a couple of weeks, to be able to make a difference in the lives of the people we represent, to stop the online trafficking that's occurring, to provide justice to those who are victims and survivors, and to ensure that, indeed, justice can be served. I see that one of my colleagues has joined us on the floor, and this is Senator Nelson, who I talked about earlier. He is the ranking Democrat on the Commerce Committee that took this legislation, clarified some points in the legislation to the point that by the time he was done with it, and by the way, he was a co-sponsor of the legislation long before that, but by the time Commerce Committee was done clarifying the legislation, listening to the testimony from both sides, he received a unanimous vote in his committee. That doesn't happen very often, Senator Nelson. And I appreciate your being on the floor today, and more importantly, appreciate your leadership on this issue.